Order. Good afternoon, members. Welcome to this afternoon's meeting of Public Accounts Committee. We are now in public session. I have to remind members that mobile phones must be set to airplane mode or turned off. It's not sufficient to put mobiles on silent mode as they continue to interfere with the Assembly recording. This session is recorded in video and audio and can be accessed via online streaming either on the Assembly website or Democracy Live. Agenda item 1 then is apologies. I have apologies received from Mr Hilditch. Any other apologies? Okay, thank you. Agenda item 2 then is the minutes of the 11th of November, which are in your pack, pages 8 to 14. Are members content these are accurate and I have your permission to sign them?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. Very short meeting, it was over at 1 minute past 3 last week.
Deputy Chair did a great job.
I just knew that was a slow food toss for you to hit there. See the gift I gave you. Okay. Agenda item 3 then is the declaration of interests. At this stage I'd like to declare that I'm a governor at Girls Model School Belfast and Edenbrook Primary School. Any other members wish to declare an interest? Mr Muir.
Member of the Board of Governors of Priory Integrated College in Hollywood.
Mr Beggs.
Member of the Board of Governors of Rodensville School in Larne.
And Chair of Nice School, the Chair of
Okay. Any others? Mr Boylan.
Yeah, Chair of Primary School outside Katie, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. So agenda item 4 then is matters arising. Any matters arising from those minutes, members? None. Thank you. Agenda item 5 then is correspondence, which is pages 18 through to 24 of your pack. We are delighted this afternoon to be joined by Mr Kieran Donnelly, CB, the Comptroller and Auditor General for Northern Ireland, Ms Catherine O'Hagan, Audit Manager, Mr Kyle Bingham, Support Officer for the Northern Ireland Northern Ireland Audit Office, who's joining us remotely. Members, I refer to correspondence dated the 12th of November 2021, page 18 of your pack from Mr McGrath, MLA, regarding recognition payment scheme. I propose to consider this a matter and close and on any other business. Are you content? Great. Members, refer to correspondence then pages 19 through 24 of Ms Tracy McAlinden regarding her concerns about special education needs. Members, are you content that we consider this correspondence agenda item 6, which is dealing with special education needs? Agreed?
Agreed.
Members, refer to correspondence, your table pack, page 3-4, received today on the 18th of November from Ms Rosemary Barton, MLA, regarding inquiry into Sports Sustainability Fund. I haven't had a chance to read this. The clerk only received it today, so I've asked that this is returned on the agenda next week for consideration. Are you content to note? Okay. Members will remain in open session to consider memorandum of reply and the impact review of special education needs. So at this stage, can we bring in Ms Colette Kane, the Director from the Northern Ireland Audit Office? Members, I'm just going to go into a short adjournment. If you just bear with me.
That's fine.
Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30.
Okay, members, we're now back in open session. Good afternoon, Colette. Welcome to the meeting.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so agenda item 6 then is the Memorandum of Reply Impact Review on Special Educational Needs, pages 29 through to 33 of your pack. And as I've said, we have Mr. Donnelly, Ms. O'Hagan, Ms. Kane and Mr. Bingham joining us from the Northern Ireland Audit Office. Members, I refer you to a correspondence dated the 21st of October 2021 in your pack at pages 29 to 33 from Dr. Mark Brown, the Accounting Officer and Permanent Secretary at the Department of Education, regarding a further memorandum of reply to the PAC's report on special educational needs. The response includes a summary of the work progress to date on each of the 7 recommendations at pages 30 to 33 of your pack. The Department and the Education Authority will continue to work to ensure that the recommendations in the report are fully addressed and that remedial actions are implemented. Members, as you will note, we have agreed to schedule further evidence session with Dr. Brown and Sarah Long, the Chief Executive of the Education Authority, regarding our Special Educational Needs report, and we will discuss the updated MOR further at this time. You content? Then, Mr. Donnelly, any comments on that at this stage?
Just some preliminary comments on it. Obviously, there's faster movement on some of the recommendations and others. There's 2 really big recommendations on commissioning reviews. The first one, an independent review of the aid to assess effectiveness. So I understand that there's someone appointed to do that. So that one is started. What would be really interesting then is for the committee to come back in when that work's complete, so we can ask when the witnesses are up what the timeline is in that. That one started. The second one was an external review of the SEND service. Now that's not moving as quick as the other one. They're still at tender stage, so the wheels sort of travel very slowly in that one. Where there has been better progress is on managing the caseload and the 26-week target. There does seem to be genuine progress on that one. I think it was at 3 points, so register there.
Okay, thank you very much. So members, are you content to discuss this in more detail when we have the meeting scheduled? Agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, members, I refer again to correspondence pages 19 to 24 of your pack from Ms. Tracy McAlinden regarding her concerns about the special educational needs system. Ms. McAlinden has been in contact with various bodies, including the Minister of Education and the Education Authority, regarding her child's education over the past 8 years. The failings in education needs provision and the failure to put in place an education recovery plan for her son. She is calling for a public inquiry and an education recovery plan. Are members content that at this stage we write to Ms. McAlinden to inform her that we have noted her correspondence, that our SEN report is now completed, but we will raise the issue with the education recovery plan and SEN provision more generally when the Department and the EA appear before the committee to discuss the progress in relation to our report on SEN later in the year. I also suggest we forward her correspondence to the Education Committee to consider the issues that go beyond the remit of this committee. Ms. McAlinden, under GDPR, has given her permission to share her correspondence with third parties if required. Members agreed?
Great.
Mr. Donnelly, anything you want to say on that?
No, it's a very sad tale and a really well written letter.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, members, refer to correspondence to the 15th of November in your table pack, pages 20-21 from the Clerk of the Youth Assembly, Peter Hall, regarding the establishment of the Youth Assembly committees. Mr. Hall will be in joint contact for the Youth Assembly, and in the weeks and months to come, the Youth Assembly will be looking to work across statutory committees that is relevant for their priorities. One of the Youth Assembly's priorities is education. Therefore, our recent SEN report and forthcoming Closing the Gap report may be of interest to the newly formed Youth Assembly. I suggest that we write back to Mr Hall welcoming the establishment of the Youth Assembly and to highlight PAC reports that may be of interest to that body. Agreed? I do need members to...
Agreed.
Good. Okay, members, we will remain in open session to hear second evidence regarding the inquiry into the Sports Sustainability Fund. And at this stage, we bring in Weir from Sport NI, Mr. Ian Weir from Sport NI. Mr. Weir, can you hear us okay? Sorry? He hasn't joined the meeting? Okay. Right. Okay, can we maybe then, at this stage, move to agenda item 7 and ask Antoinette, the Chief Executive of Sport NI, to join us then in person? Thanks. That's great, thank you. Hello, Mr. Weir. Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Good afternoon, yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. You're very welcome. We're just waiting on Antoinette joining us. Members, I'm going to hear from Antoinette McKeown regarding our inquiry to Sports Sustainability Fund in your pack, papers for reference. The clerk's briefing dated 8th of November and the second evidence session, pages 35-37. The Sports Sustainability Fund, Sport NI key extracts from Hansard report on the 8th of July 2021 covering the relevant evidence session by the Public Accounts Committee, pages 38-40. And then follow-up letter from Tracy Mahar, pages 41-43. Response from Tracy Mahar, pages 44-67. Sports Sustainability Fund Board Paper Award Approval Framework 68-78. Sports Sustainability Fund Sport NI Board Paper Awards, pages 79-89. Sports Sustainability Fund Sport NI Paper Investment Decisions at pages 90-92. And then on page 93, a biography of Antoinette McKeown, the Chief Executive, who has just joined us. Antoinette, welcome to the meeting. You're very welcome.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay. So, do you want to say anything or by means of presentation before we start?
I just had a very short introductory statement to make, if that's okay, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here this afternoon to answer any follow-up questions that you might have following the evidence-given session that we provided on the 8th of July. Sport and I undertook its preparation for that session very seriously indeed, knowing the role of this committee. I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity to clarify today the context and timing of legal advice sought by Sport NI as discussed on the 8th of July meeting. When the committee followed up with correspondence to seek further clarification on the content of our evidence, I obviously immediately read the transcript, and I recognised on reading the transcript at that time that there may have been cause for some confusion in the evidence that I gave, and I'm grateful to be here today to clarify that. We were talking a lot about hindsight, and in instances where I was giving evidence around hindsight, I conflated a legal position that Sport and I took at the time in early 2021 at the time of decision making with the legal advice that we subsequently sought to confirm that position in terms of giving you additional assurances as the Public Accounts Committee. Actually, we sought that legal advice specifically to give you additional independent assurance that the position that we took at the time was reasonable in the circumstances, and as accounting officer I felt it was important to this committee and to the public that I give that we sought that legal advice. So it was never my intention, obviously, to mislead the committee in any way, and if I have caused confusion for that, I apologise, but I'm grateful to answer any questions you might have on that, or indeed any other questions from the 8th of July session.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, there was concern expressed by the committee in terms of the timeline, and we're grateful for you coming back to answer further questions around the issue, because on the 8th of July you indicated that the scheme could not have been amended even with the size of the payments became apparent. I think if I'm quoting you accurately, had we not invested the funding or legal advice, we were leaving ourselves open to litigation, and that would have put the entire scheme at risk. I note that according to the follow-up correspondence from DFC to the committee on the 8th of October, the legal advice was received on the 5th of July. It's 3 days before your evidence session to us on the 8th of July. Therefore, it's not clear to us that the legal advice was not available when the board was making its decisions in March. So the committee was left with the impression by yourself that the legal advice was sought at the time. Can you explain how this happened?
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely, and what I would say is when I read the transcript myself, I recognised immediately that there was certainly cause for confusion, and as I said, in looking in hindsight and talking in hindsight, I think there were two questions, one by Ms Flynn and one by yourself, Mr Beggs, in respect of the legal advice sought. When the board was making a decision in early 21 in respect of all of the awards that had been bid for across the governing bodies of sport, because we took governing bodies of sport and their clubs together as one application. We did discuss at board level and with our board members the large amounts on two particular amounts. We took a position based on our own extensive experience in Sport NI of grant awards and our previous experience around some of the issues and challenges that we might face. We were clear at the time that we couldn't, on the basis of what at that time was a consideration around media commentary or media criticism about inappropriate large awards being given to two particular clubs. We felt that we had set the criteria from the outset. We had published that criteria, that sporting organisations who met that threshold and met that full criteria we could not simply say we're not giving you the money on an arbitrary decision. And our legal position at that time is that we would be open to legal challenge, and it was contrary to the integrity of the organisation that had published criteria that we couldn't simply change in the middle of that. In preparation for the committee on the 29th of June this year, we were discussing with D4C colleagues the position that we took, and we considered that it was reasonable, and it remained reasonable on the end of June. There was a accounting officer in agreement with D4C. We thought it would be useful to seek retrospective legal assurance to provide this committee with that higher level of assurance. And we sought that legal advice on the 30th of June from a leading law firm who was not able to provide that advice due to conflict of interest. We then, on the 1st of July, went to a second law firm, and on the 5th of July we received that advice, and we shared it on the 6th of July with our D4C colleagues. That legal advice is legally privileged, but I'm happy to outline to the committee what it said, but it did confirm that we were leaving ourselves open to legal challenge had we made a decision not to award.
Okay. So the decisions to award the monies were made in March?
Yes.
You've just given an evidence to this committee statement that the Sport NI was potentially open to legal challenge. Can I ask then, Why was legal advice requested after those key decisions were made?
Because we were confident in March that we would have been open to legal challenge had we arbitrarily stopped funding to one or more sporting organisations who had met the criteria for the award. And in preparation for this committee, I sought retrospective legal advice, and it confirmed that we were leaving ourselves, we would have left ourselves open to legal challenge.
So I'm right in saying you sought not one but two sets of legal advice before you came to this committee?
No, sorry. I just want to be really clear that I'm not misleading the committee in any way. In March, we were confident as an executive team, and our legal position reached in discussions, and fairly extensive discussions with our board members who did subject the awards proposed to significant scrutiny. But we were confident in the position that we reached that we would have been left open. But we sought and received legal advice in preparation for this committee to provide that assurance.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. But you sought not one set but two sets of legal advice, no?
No.
I thought you said second set of legal advice in your presentation.
No, sorry. We sought on the 30th of June, we sought legal advice from a leading law firm, but they were not able to give us that advice. So we went to a second law firm on the 1st of July.
Okay, so we've established legal advice was sought because you were coming in front of this committee.
Yeah.
What led, if you were confident and you and your board were, the decision was you and your board, yes?
Yes.
In terms of
the decision
March
was the board ultimately,
yes,
but
yes,
I
yes,
recommended
sure.
as accounting officer.
So those decisions are made in March to award the monies. What eroded that confidence that led you to seek legal advice?
I don't believe there was an erosion of confidence. I wanted to provide this committee with the highest level of assurance that we could give, and I wanted to get independent confirmation or otherwise of the decision that we took, that had we not awarded money to sporting organisations who met the threshold and met the terms and conditions of the grant award, that leaving ourselves or arbitrarily deciding not to provide any or all of that money would lead ourselves open to litigation, and we received that confirmation.
So with hindsight, would it not have been better to get the legal advice in March?
Absolutely, I will accept that, Chair. Though we were confident in March that we would be leaving ourselves open to litigation, and I think at that time we were moving in a fast-changing, fast-paced environment, and as I said, we are looking at this now in hindsight. But I do believe that the confidence that we had in March stood up to independent legal scrutiny in July, and we were able to provide that assurance.
Yeah. Is it fair to ask how much the legal advice cost the taxpayer?
Absolutely. We used, in terms of ensuring good value for public money, and we used the government framework for this legal advice, but to give visibility and transparency, we also asked for a cost, and that cost was provided to us at £1,500, so £1,500 plus VAT.
Okay. I'll pose my question at the moment and bring in Mr. Beggs, the Deputy Chair.
Did you seek any advice from the department at all?
We were working very closely with the department the whole way through this, and we had advised the department and had discussed with the department the fact that we had reached a decision of board that to arbitrarily not, as
Did you seek any legal advice through the department? What was their legal advice?
No, we didn't seek any legal advice at that. In March, we didn't seek any legal advice. We sought it in early July.
Okay, and were you aware during this period of COVID funding of the wind turbines issue, where a wind turbine were getting sizable grants even though COVID had that zero effect on their wind production, and the Department of Enterprise decided to exclude them from payments because it was unreasonable to give them additional money when they didn't need it? Were you aware of that issue, that some people did change their grant structure midstream?
We were fully focused on funding to the sports sector on the basis of evidence that we had that they were in crisis management mode, and my focus and the focus of the Board of Sport NI was in actually ensuring that the sector remained intact, sufficient to help Northern Ireland recover from COVID. So that's where we were at the time.
Now, you say you can't share the legal advice, it's legal privilege. What risk is there in sharing the advice? Because surely no one was adversely affected by you following the legal advice, so surely there is no risk if you were to share that with, for instance, the audit office. We don't actually have to see it. Would you accept that there's zero risk were you to share, to give confidence to the auditor and this committee through that means as to what the form of the advice was?
I would say that there's a long established concept of legal advice being privileged. So as a matter of principle, we're saying there's nothing here in relation to risks that we're taking this decision. We're based on the premise of very well established legal principle that legal advice is privileged. But I'm happy to outline, more than happy to outline to the committee today what that legal advice is.
I have a further question
Sure.
first, if I may. Did that legal advice take into consideration one of the fundamental principles of the scheme, which was that it was meant to be supporting sporting organisations which might be in risk of closure because of difficulty and to gain income during COVID?
That wasn't a principle of the scheme. That was an element in the business case that talked about imminent threat of closure. It was not a principle of the scheme. And I think we had rehearsed that on the 8th of July, and I'm happy to reiterate that the principles of the scheme were related to transparency, integrity and consistency, and that's essentially the principles in which we made the decision, or our board made the decision in March.
You didn't follow the principal business case in how you operate the scheme? We
followed the business case, but the business case was a document of over 100 pages, and one of the areas that, and naturally appropriate given the level of funding that we were taking stewardship of. But there was an element in the business case that said there was a threat of imminent risk of closure for some sports, but it was not a principle on which we awarded funding.
I understand some groups actually increased their bank balance during the period before receipt of your grant, and yet they still received the grant. Do you think that was the purpose of the scheme?
We applied the criteria that we had set from the outset. Of course, had we had more time, and if we weren't working in the period of uncertainty within which we were working, and we weren't working with the pace of change at that time, we had, at the period actually where we were considering awards, we were in a second lockdown. So there was a high degree of uncertainty. We were working at a fast pace, but with due diligence. But we deliberately designed the scheme on the basis of openness, transparency and consistency in how we applied, because we didn't have the time at the time to do individual modelling of each of the sports. We simply didn't have the time. And had we had the time to do that, we recognise in hindsight that would have been much better for all of us. But we applied the scheme consistently, and the reality of that was that two particular golf organisations did get a very high award, and we have learnt the lessons from that, and we've actually taken those lessons into other schemes.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McHugh.
Fáilte Rove and Shaw and you're very welcome here today. Anthony, just a general question. What's the usual protocol for receiving legal advice, say, within sport? And would you accept that there's an inherent risk, in taking decisions without seeking proper legal advice at that point in time?
There's always an inherent risk in any major decisions that any public sector body makes. If we were to seek legal advice on every decision that there was an inherent risk on, we'd be running up a very hefty legal bill. We have extensive experience of administering grant awards, it's my view, and it remains my view, that when we advised at the board, and at the time the board accepted, that if we were to arbitrarily decide not to award funding to sporting organisations who had met the threshold, had met the published criteria, that we would leave ourselves open to litigation. And that was based on our experience and long-standing work in grant awards. So I didn't believe there was I thought there was more of a risk in not awarding that money than actually awarding it.
Yes, you had said earlier that, in fact, that at that point in time it was like a legal appreciation by the board itself, and the decision that they were arriving at. But is there a protocol? Is there a protocol, say, within Sports NI in relation to when it is that you should seek legal advice?
Apologies, I understand now what you're saying. Seeking legal advice comes down to sound judgment. If there's a particularly contentious issue for which there is a higher level of risk, and we simply haven't had that experience before. So it's more sound judgment than actual protocol. I don't, as an accounting officer, have a protocol that says, in this instance, you must seek legal advice. So that doesn't exist.
Okay, Mr. Muir.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Antoinette, for coming along. Probably just two things. Just whether you agree or you have an understanding that the perception would be that the legal advice was sought because of this PAC inquiry. So to try to firm up an argument to make in relation to the funding. Is that something you could understand, where the impression could clearly be given that that legal advice was sought retrospectively to aid the inquiry in terms of the evidence you were given to that?
No, I do hear what you're saying, and I immediately recognised when I read the transcript when Chair, your follow-up letter came into the Permanent Secretary. I recognised immediately when I read the transcript that I could absolutely have caused confusion. It certainly wasn't my intention, but I absolutely sought that legal advice to provide additional assurance to this committee, and that was the reason for that advice. And in discussions with Department for Committee colleagues, we agreed it would be useful to have that advice, and that was genuinely the reason why we sought the advice. But I recognise that my evidence conflated the decision making in March with the advice taken later, and it was certainly not my intention.
And thank you for that, because I think the frustration is that the advice was obtained to aid the evidence session, and the reason I'm frustrated about this, and other members may be, is that there's clear issues about the value for money and whether it was achieved in relation to the Sports Sustainability Fund. I don't feel it was, and many other people don't either. So we're sitting in a situation now where people are facing a cost of living crisis, struggling to meet fuel bills, but some of the money that was spent out here, massive questions in relation to whether it was value for money. The frustration I have is that from yourselves and also from the Department of Communities, I have yet to hear any acknowledgement that there is questions about the value for money in the spend that was undertaken. No acknowledgement of that, and I think that was the frustration of the evidence session previously and the correspondence to date. And do you understand that there's serious questions about the value for money? You know, some of the cases were made for the funding, particularly in relation to some sports, that it was more an economic development thing and a tourism thing, but primary basis for this scheme was not economic development and tourism. So I just want to hear from yourself a bit more about that value for money concerns, because this is one of the queries that I found extremely frustrating.
And look, I don't think any of us, having been participated in the evidence given session on the 8th of July, Andrew, or indeed were listening to media commentary, I just probably around, I think it was June, May, June time. It was June time actually. Coming from the Stephen Nolan show, there was questions being asked, well, by Stephen Nolan and subsequently on the 8th of July by this committee. So yes, we recognise there were value for money issues being raised. I know that we have certainly learned lessons, Andrew, in terms of how we delivered this scheme. And again, I think the pace of delivery didn't allow us for that modelling. Had we modelled, we would have seen different circumstances for different sports. But the reality is that Royal County Down, Royal Portrush did meet the threshold for the scheme, and we stand by the decision to award the money on the basis that to do so would have caused litigation, but also because golf is one of the biggest sports in Northern Ireland. This is among the highest numbers in terms of golf participation. We secured the Open on the back of the huge sporting legacy that we built up around golf. And yes, the Open netted £100 million of economic benefit, and we recognise that sport actually does have an economic benefit. It just doesn't have a participation or social community benefit, and we take all of that into account. We do know that had we not provided the money to Royal Portrush, Royal Portadown, or Royal County Down, that if we hadn't provided that money, they would not have been able to go ahead with the sporting investment that they needed to make to that. I'm also conscious that the Golf Open is coming back to Northern Ireland, but that speaks to the legacy of that sport and not to an economic. It's not to an economic decision, though it is to our economic benefit. One of the things that we were really delighted with is in the review of the Open, that given we're trying to widen participation among younger people, we had over 30,000 young people attend the Open, and 21,000 of them were under the age of 16, and they were given free access to the Open as part of that scheme. So we know that there have been very serious questions around value for money. I stand by a belief, based on the evidence that we reviewed at the time, that had we not invested almost 25 million into sports, some of our sports may not be here today. And in fact, our sports are still struggling. Currently, according to a recent survey that we've just undertaken.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Irwin.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. And you did say earlier that the benefit of hindsight is a wonderful thing. And I mean, certainly, I fully understand that the benefit of hindsight is an issue. But if looking back, do you accept that the criteria for settling the funding and releasing the funding was flawed then in relation to this issue?
I'm sorry, Chair, is it possible to have the question repeated?
William, could you re-ask the question, please?
On the benefit of hindsight, do you accept that the criteria for the releasing of the funding was flawed?
I believe that had we had more time, some of the issues that we discussed on the 8th of July, just around lessons learned, had we more time, we would have done more modelling, and that additional modelling would have actually brought out differences in different sports. We have a very, very diverse sports sector with 78 governing bodies. We know that we should have put, or could have put, an additional challenge function. We discussed this on the 8th of July, an additional challenge function around the design of the scheme. And interestingly, in a recent scheme the Sport NI has just launched, we actually did learn that lesson, and we put in that additional challenge function. We also recognise in the early lessons learned that where substantial amounts of money were being considered, that we should have included a specific statement around need, and I think our Permanent Secretary Tracy did say that on the 8th of July. And likewise, reservations or reserves held by organisations. Had we more time, we could have delved more deeply into that. We had the skills to do that at the time, but we simply didn't have the time. But there are some of the additional measures or controls that would have certainly improved the design of the scheme.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask, in terms of the awards, Antoinette, and the fallout that you've touched on yourself, and not least in the media around this, is Sport NI facing litigation from any club now around failure to award?
No.
No?
No, we're not.
A number of members have made the mention of the benefit of hindsight. With that in mind, had legal advice been taken and sought in March when you were shaping, finishing the shaping of the scheme, do you not think that if legal advice had been taken at that time, you may well have been able to address many of the negative aspects of the scheme that have flown, not least in the public domain and the media?
Well, if we look at the decision that the board took at the time, and the position of the board at the time was that if we had refused to provide any or all of the award from a sporting organisation that met the threshold, met all of the published criteria, the litigation was that, or the legal advice that we got in preparation for this committee was that we would have been open to legal challenge. So I don't think that would have made a difference, because the independent legal advice supported the legal position that the board took at the time. I think the other thing is that when we were making decisions, or when I as accounting officer was making the recommendations to our board, we had a particular window to make the decisions. We had gathered all of the evidence from the governing bodies and their clubs. We want to commend the governing bodies for the work that they did, and indeed our own staff over the period to gather that evidence. We were sitting with a risk of litigation on one side that was, you know, and the risk that if we actually stalled the scheme to review this, that we were putting at risk all of the other applications at a period of time. So that was the balance, and that's the judgment, you know, you have to take at any one given time.
Sure. I think you're right. I mean, I'm involved in a number of sports clubs myself. I'm very interested in sport. And I know a lot of clubs locally would have been coming to my door very concerned about even their survival.
Yeah.
So that's an undeniable case. You made mention that there were, I think you said 78 sporting bodies, is that right?
Yeah.
In Northern Ireland. And how much money did you eventually distribute?
We distributed, I'm going to ask my colleague Ian here to come in for the final figure, because we're still undergoing due diligence checks as we speak. Ian?
I think it's 23.01 million.
And can you give us a breakdown of where those monies went, Ian, to the various sports?
Not from memory here, Chair, but certainly it's published on our website and has been from the commencement of the programme in terms of...
Yeah, and I have figures in front of me, but
Yeah.
Given what your Chief Executive has just said, those figures are not complete, you know, in the sense that there's obviously work that you're doing, it's not complete, and there are other potential allegations in terms of due diligence that may well be going out there, yes?
No, sorry, I don't want to miss... Sorry.
Right, go
I
ahead.
was just going to comment, sorry, Chair and Antoinette, that the awards are complete, but the due diligence is ongoing to verify the amounts and certain cross-checking of data from other data sources. To date, of that 23.01 million, I think there's been approximately £36,000 worth of errors identified, which is 0.16% of the overall programme. So certainly there will be no additional monies awarded. There may be monies clawed back, and as I said, to date it's a small amount, being that £36,000 based on the errors identified through our post-payment due diligence.
So, of the 78 bodies in Northern Ireland that represent the 78 sports, how many of those sports receive funding?
I think there was 35.
35 bodies? 35
Correct.
sports? Okay.
35 organisations.
Okay, whenever the organisation was working with DFC around the model and the scheme, which, as I've said, was much needed to provide vital lifeline for clubs. Obviously, senior officials, permanent secretary and so on from the department were involved in those negotiations and those discussions, I presume. Did the department offer or proffer legal support from the department's own legal team? Was it asked for?
Just supposed to be clear that the discussions and design of the scheme were led by Assistant Secretary level and myself in working closely together. And we had support from a range of staff, both in D4C and in Sport NI, as I'd said, with a range of expertise around this issue. We did, at the point of taking the decision, I was confident at the point in which the board were discussing this that we would be leaving ourselves open to litigation if we decided not to award, and therefore we didn't seek legal advice from either D4C in terms of Departmental Solicitor's Office or externally.
Did the assistant, when you say the assistant permanent secretary, how about?
Assistant Secretary.
Permanent secretary or?
No, the Assistant Secretary. The Assistant Secretary would have been briefing the Permanent Secretary.
Okay.
The Permanent Secretary was not directly involved in daily negotiations or discussions.
At any point did DFC offer legal advice or suggest legal advice might be a good thing?
Yes, on the 29th of June, in preparation for this committee. Not in March, but Sport and I was satisfied that we would be leaving ourselves open to legal challenge, and we didn't seek that advice because we didn't think it was necessary at that time.
What do you mean you thought you were confident, you believed in yourselves open to legal challenge and you didn't?
We were confident on the basis of the discussions that we had at board meetings in March that had we decided not to award any or all of the monies to, for example, Royal Portrush or Royal County Down, that we were confident that we were taking a risk of leaving ourselves open to litigation.
You were confident you were taking a risk? Yeah?
We were confident that we were leaving ourselves open to litigation.
Right. And that I find absolutely understandable. But then on the other side of that, I therefore cannot understand why your organisation or the Department for Communities did not feel, because you were open to that risk, that legal advice would have been a good thing.
I think if you're asking me if D4C should have taken legal advice, I can't answer that. I think that's probably better answered by D4C.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, when you working with the department, were shaping this programme, at no point you've said what you thought, what your organisation's view was. At no point did DFC come forward and suggest that even their legal advice from their internal legal department would be a good thing.
We did take legal advice around vouching, for example. So in terms of the T's and C's, which is fairly standard practice in Sport NI, that where we're offering grant awards, that we get Departmental Solicitor's Office to look at the terms and conditions, the vouching, for example, model that we're putting in place. So we did indeed receive Departmental Solicitor's Office advice around that. But I want to be absolutely clear to this committee that it was not advice in relation to whether or not to award grant aid, but it was in relation to the terms and conditions and making sure that they were watertight.
Okay. You know, this committee has asked before for a copy of the legal advice, and that was declined. Suggestion made by the Vice Chair earlier about that legal advice being given to the Northern Ireland Audit Office. Is that something which you can consider or agree to?
I can certainly consider it, Chair, but I hold very, very dear to the principle of legal advice being legally privileged. It's centuries old. It's a centuries old concept, and I think as a matter of principle, I'm happy to share, as I said, right now, the outline of that legal advice. I'm happy to provide an outline of that legal advice to the Controller and Auditor General. But I would ask for the concept of legal advice being legally privileged as a concept to be respected.
Okay, Mr. Beggs, do you want to go?
Yeah, we've learned here that at the end of June there were no claims for litigation, and in that situation you paid £1,500 of public funds for legal advice. Retrospectively, to support your appearance in front of this committee of the retrospective decisions made, do you think that is good use of public money?
I sought retrospective legal advice to provide additional independent assurance to this committee.
Do you realise that if we wanted legal advice, we could seek legal advice? And certainly I would be very concerned if we get the situation that individuals or groups appearing in front of this committee take legal advice when there's no litigation happening. So I am actually questioning again the spending of that £1,500. Who actually authorised the expenditure of the £1,500?
I authorised the expenditure
Did
as
the board
accounting
authorise
officer. As accounting officer, I have I can sign off and approve funding up to £500,000. So I signed it off as accounting officer.
And did you seek approval from the board, or even retrospective approval from the board for that expenditure?
I didn't need it as accounting officer. It's part of my role to take legal advice.
So that's a no.
No, I didn't. No, I didn't.
Okay. Mr. Irwin, your electronic hand is up. Are you looking to come back in? You're muted.
Sorry, no, you're okay. I hadn't taken it down from the last time. Okay. Sure, no.
Okay. Any other members?
I've got a question in a different area, if I may.
That's fine, yes.
It's to do with support for golf clubs. And in your evidence, you said that Scottish golf, we were looking at comparisons, Scottish golf clubs had opened continually from May 2020. But I actually understand that the Scottish clubs, the Scottish and Northern Ireland clubs here were restricted from January to March. The only difference between the Scottish and Northern Ireland clubs was they were restricted between January to March when the Scottish weren't, which is outside the period of time of the grant.
What?
So during the period of the time of the grant, can you confirm there was no difference between the arrangements?
There were, and this is where we find it difficult to make absolute comparative analysis between Scotland and Northern Ireland. Scotland had a series of localised lockdowns, different times, different regions that affected different golf clubs. So it was very difficult for us to get a handle on the impact of Scotland versus the impact on golf in Northern Ireland. We were comparing apples with pears. It wasn't possible to do that straight comparison.
Presumably if there's an outbreak in a club here somewhere, there would have been a lockdown here as well. I mean, was it a geographical complete lockdown or a lockdown because there was an outbreak of COVID in that particular club?
No, it wasn't in a particular club. It was in a particular community or region of Scotland, and it did not relate specifically to an outbreak in an individual sports club. It was where COVID numbers were rising in a particular location that particular area went into additional restrictions, including closures. And that was the Scottish model, whereas we had complete lockdown and then we had the easements.
And did the Scottish get any additional funds when they were locked down?
I don't believe that they did.
So whether they were open or closed, we were still very much more generous in the money that we were given than other golf clubs throughout the British Isles.
Well, what I would say is that the Northern Ireland Executive very kindly made available to us 25 million to actually support the sports sector right across the piece. And we supported, you supported, the Northern Ireland Executive supported the sports sector right across the piece, and we're really grateful that you did.
Thanks.
Okay, so the executive gave you 25 million, yes? And you've spent just over 23.
Yeah.
What happened to the balance of the money?
That would have been returned or reallocated. I'm going to ask Ian to come in because we to answer this question. Thank you, Ian.
I think it's been returned, Antoinette.
Yeah.
It's been returned?
Yeah.
Okay. No other member has indicated any other questions. You made the decision in March. You've expended the money, and those clubs have received it, £23 million going into 35 different sports. Do you believe the distribution has been fair and equitable?
I think it has been. I think it has reflects the membership of the sporting bodies that we have actually invested in. So we have a huge diversity in the sector, and we have, for example, we have membership that GA, for example, 171,000 membership. We have we will have maybe top 8 organisations in terms of membership, and there will have been a proportionate money invested in those sports according to the clubs that came forward and the governing bodies that came forward for the money. Okay. So we recognise that there were the 4 major sports got a considerable amount of money, but that's reflective of where they sit.
Of the £23 million, football, Gaelic, rugby, golf are the 4 major sports you're talking about. How much of the £23 million went to those 4 sports?
I don't have those figures right in front of me, but I absolutely. And again, it's on our website. But I will get that sent to the committee.
And the other point I was going to make is, and I declare an interest as a member and vice president of Woodvale Cricket Club. Those sports that have a huge number of sports development officers or whatever, centrally or with clubs, have a huge advantage over those that don't. Some of those sports are professional, some of them professional in practice, if not in name. Sports like cricket and hockey, how can they possibly compete?
Well, it's interesting that one of the case studies that we looked at was a cricket one. I can't recall the exact name of the cricket club off the top of my head, but one of the things that a particular cricket club said was that because they were able to pay to have their facilities maintained, when the restrictions lifted, they were able to bring their young people straight back onto the field of play, whereas if that hadn't been maintained and they hadn't received money for that maintenance, they could not have done that.
And that's money from your organisation?
That was money from, yes.
And that will be because there's a skill set within that club. That's my point.
Yeah.
That's not universal. And I think one of the things that needs to be borne in mind here is that sports like cricket and the distribution of monies by your organisation and by the Department of Communities bears that out, in that cricket does not get the money it should, in my opinion. That needs to be looked at by organisations like yourselves proactively to ensure that those sports do get a fair share. And I think, and finally, can I ask you, in terms of the scheme that was rolled out, decided in March, rolled out, and £23 million invested in local sport, much needed, as I've said, are there lessons to be learned from how you did it? Would you do it differently, and what are those lessons?
Yeah, I think as I said earlier, I think first of all I would say is that I'm very happy to give evidence this afternoon on the Sports Sustainability Fund. I think in terms of how Sport NI in general distributes money across the sports, there's a whole variety and range of variables around that. And it includes working very closely, as we do, with Cricket Ireland. Sorry, Antoinette. Cricket Ireland is the national cricket team for Ireland. Yeah. I'm talking. The money goes to the Republic, down to Dublin for the Cricket Ireland setup. It doesn't go to local clubs in Northern Ireland on the ground. Just for the record, that is the case. Well, we have funded cricket in Northern Ireland, and I would rather.
I know the answer to that.
Yeah.
One or two clubs, and you know that.
Well, I'm happy to provide further information in relation to Sport NI's wider funding to cricket and wider funding to sport. I don't have that information in front of me because I am here this afternoon to answer questions around the Sports Sustainability Fund. I think, as I said earlier, had we had the time to undertake modelling, if you remember, the fund opened, I think the fund opened just before Christmas in November. We closed in January. We simply didn't have time. And when I look back now at just how things were changing, literally on a daily basis at that time, making decisions as we were going into a second lockdown, it was an incredibly difficult, volatile, uncertain period. And yes, as public sector leaders, we all live with uncertainty, but this uncertainty was particularly high. So we simply did not have time to do the modelling that we would normally do in other grant schemes that we offer. We will have a clear modelling in terms of what's the differences and what are the different contexts for football as there are for cricket, as there are for boxing, as there are for golf, for example. We didn't have time to do that modelling. And I think if we could have ironed out some of the idiosyncrasies that were there, we would have definitely had a wider lens on some of the implications of the decision we took around consistency. For example, we would have brought that additional challenge function, as I said, in the design of the scheme, and we have done that in a more recent D4C Sport NI partnership grant scheme that we've just opened around capital, where organisations were seeking substantial amounts of money. We could have sought additional information around evidence need. And had we had, and we could have done that regardless of the time. In hindsight, we recognise that. But also, had we had more time, we could have done more, I suppose, scrutiny of the reserves held by different sporting organisations. We didn't have the time. So there's some of the lessons learned, and look, there will be more undoubtedly, but that's where we are at the minute in terms of how we're rolling that into further decisions being made.
You're doing a piece of work on that, so that if there's a future, hope not, but if there's a future tranche of money that goes out on a similar scheme, that those lessons will be learned and the scheme more refined for any future distributions of money.
Yeah, absolutely. We are working with colleagues in the Department for Communities and other ALBs on actually ensuring that the lessons we learned from a range of schemes is being understood by all of us and taken account of. So I'm glad you raised that point.
Okay. Mr. Muir.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, for allowing me to come in. I've just to pick up on the value for money stuff, okay? Because I want to be able to leave here with a very clear impression of what your view is in this. Because there's ministerial direction, it's not in relation to yourself, it's another department, as part of our papers here today. So that's where the Permanent Secretary probably advised in different scenarios by the ALB that value for money can't be assured. Okay? This is very different. There was no ministerial direction for this. So I'm unsure when I'm leaving this whether were satisfied that was value for money achieved. Because my view is it wasn't, and it should have required a ministerial direction. No ministerial direction was given, retrospective legal advice was given, evidence was coming to this committee at the beginning of July trying to justify the scheme. Is it your view that value for money was achieved, or was it not?
I want to say that it was not for Sport NI to come to the committee on the 8th of July to justify the scheme in its entirety. We recognise questions have been raised around value for money in respect of two particular awards. I believe, taking into account the widest lens possible, that those awards, as I said, met the threshold. Had we had different criteria, we may have come up with a different results, but we didn't. I think on the basis of ministerial direction, One of the things that I'm really conscious of, and when I look back at, as I said, how uncertain the time was, I have absolutely no doubt that D4C's Permanent Secretary and Sport NI's board and myself as the accounting officer for Sport NI, our focus was on supporting a very unstable sports sector. We could have taken time, out of a very short time frame to seek ministerial direction, but we decided to be brave and decided on the basis of the evidence that we had that we actually needed to support the sector, and that's what we did.
Okay. You made a statement there that it wasn't really for yourselves to make that judgment, it was for the department. The argument back, I would say to you, is as an ALB or a non-departmental public body, it's also, from my view, it's your duty and responsibility to raise the hand and say I have concerns in relation to value for money. Yes,
and at the time of the scheme design and decisions taken, I have absolutely a duty as accounting officer to seek ministerial direction. We were working very closely with D4C colleagues. We had the support of the Permanent Secretary, who, let's be clear, was not sitting with two figures in respect of two sporting organisations in front of her. But we were focused on getting money to the sector at the time, and at that time I did not seek ministerial direction or specific direction from the Permanent Secretary, and because my focus was on getting support to the sector on the basis of evidenced need.
Mr. Biggs.
Like the chairman, I've been contacted by a smaller club that I felt aggrieved. They would have had part-time staff, casual staff, and they took the very difficult decision to pay everybody off early on because they want to survive. That was probably with the furlough scheme. I don't know the exact timing. And then they ran fundraising events during the year to try and sustain a bank balance, and they were turned down from the scheme. Do you understand why they feel aggrieved that some very wealthy organisations literally got millions?
No, absolutely, Roy, I do. And we have, as I said, a very diverse sector. Some of our very small governing bodies literally went to ground and they just didn't operate. They didn't open, so they didn't have any expenses because they simply stopped. Others paid off staff. Other clubs were actually in the process of paying off staff and closing their clubs when the money came through. We know that there were some sporting clubs that didn't get access to the Sports Sustainability Fund. The Sports Hardship Fund, through a very, very wide net across the sporting organisations to give those small grants to smaller clubs, and that had been available before the Sports Sustainability Fund. I don't know, and I don't expect you to mention the individual club, but it's very hard for me to talk about an individual club without going back and looking over the range of support that we put in place, not just the Sports Sustainability Fund, but a number of other support services that we put in place at that time, and why this particular club wasn't able to avail of any of them. I'm happy to take this offline if that's of any use.
Appreciate that.
Okay, no other member has indicated they won't ask another question. Can I thank you very much for coming?
Not at all.
I'll just make one point in the reference that Mr. Beggs has just made. I think for some clubs, it's not a level, and I've had this complaint. There have been some high-profile clubs in my constituency that have got money, other clubs that were really backs against the wall who didn't, and who were really concerned that they weren't going to be able to survive. And a lot of volunteer work did go on to ensure those clubs did survive, but it was very touch and go. I think one of the things, and when you lessons learned around this, is that where there is a large sporting organisation like the big four you've mentioned, possibly add boxing in, I don't know, where there is a resource, for some of them a very considerable resource at the centre of advice and support that can go out in terms of development officers and so on, where those other sports that don't have that, the capability and the capacity of those clubs that don't have to be taken into consideration, because by nature of the thing, a natural, fair and equitable playing field, I can use that term, isn't going to exist.
And look, I understand what you're saying, Chair. We went through the governing bodies. They weren't there just as an extra admin layer. They were there because they knew their clubs intimately and to provide that additional support to their clubs. And Sport NI also made available our development, sports development staff for any governing body who was struggling to submit an application. We had offered support to support them in doing that.
Okay.
But again, it was with almost 3,000 clubs in Northern Ireland and the timescale that we had, it wasn't possible to offer that support to every club.
Okay, that brings an end to members' questions. Mr. Donnelly, have you any questions or comments you'd like to make at this point? No, sir. Mr. Stevenson, have you anything you want to ask or say at this stage?
No, thank you.
Okay. Mr. McGowan, thanks again for coming to the meeting today and discussing the issue with us and assisting us in getting some clarification. Thank you.
Thanks a million.
Okay, Mr. Stevenson, you're free to leave the meeting now if that's okay with you. Thank you very much for your attendance today. Okay, members, with your permission, then we'll go into closed session.
Agreed.
Committee room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room